Britain desperately needed to win. As if to highlight Britain's bad luck, during a fierce battle in the Denmark Strait on May 21, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen dealt the island kingdom a severe blow by sinking the battlecruiser HMS Hood and seriously damaging the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales. Despite the fact that the Germans had won the naval battle, Bismarck was severely damaged, and her captain, Capitaine zur See Ernst Lindemann, had to set sail for Saint Nazaire, France, where the repair docks are located. Prior to the war, the Atlantic port of Saint Nazaire was well known for possessing the biggest dry dock and repair facilities in the world. It is arguably most known for its fiercely guarded submarine pens. Since the Normandy, the largest passenger liner in the world, moored there in between cruises, its largest dock was actually called the Normandy Dock. However, Bismarck never made it to Saint Nazaire. On the morning of May 27, 1941, fighters from the British aircraft carrier HM Sark Royal attacked the 5,000-ton battleship, which had been launched on February 14, 1939, with the expected goal of controlling the seas. The battleships HMS Rodney and King George V, together with a host of destroyers and cruisers, were among the British fleet's many ships that attacked her after aerial torpedoes jammed her rudder. Avoiding another Bismarck. About 300 nautical miles west of Ushant, France, Bismarck sank beneath the waves in 15,700 feet of sea after her guns had stopped firing by 10 a.m. 1995 people died out of Bismarck's 2,200 crew. At the behest of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the British Admiralty decided that the facilities at Saint Nazaire had to be shut down because of concerns that Bismarck's bigger and more potent sister ship, Tirpitz, which was holed up in a Norwegian fjord, might eventually reach the port and use it as a base for raiding Atlantic shipping. The Admiralty thought that Tirpitz would never leave her safe haven if the port's repair facilities were destroyed or substantially damaged. Churchill was the driving force behind this. He decided to revoke his earlier declaration that silly fiascos were prohibited and launch a bold commando raid against one of the most difficult targets in all of Nazi-controlled Europe, Saint Nazaire's heavily fortified Normandy dock. He knew that a significant spectacular victory was necessary to lift his country's flagging spirits. Initially, it was believed that a Royal Air Force RAF air raid might make the port unusable, but that idea was abandoned. In addition to the fact that Saint Nazaire was surrounded by a strong ring of anti-aircraft weaponry that rendered a few earlier attacks futile, the neighboring town was home to a sizable civilian population, and the British were hesitant to risk their lives in a raid that might turn out to be less than accurate. They'd have to find another method. Then a seaborne commando raid was contemplated, but it was also viewed as a high-risk operation, this time for the assailants. The port is located 5 miles up the treacherous estuary of the River Loire, and is only approachable from the sea by a single narrow channel, which, in 1942, was covered by several batteries of coast defense guns, according to Ken Ford, author of A History of the Saint Nazaire Raid. However, Churchill assigned British Chief of Combined Operations, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the responsibility of coming up with a plan to demolish the installations in January 1942. The great plan that Mountbatten and his staff came up with would depend on the men's unwavering bravery and nerves to execute. Many unknowns, dangerous in the extreme. Using an obsolete British destroyer that had been modified to resemble a German battleship and loaded with explosives and commandos using a time delay fuse, the plan was to ram the outer gates of the dry dock in the middle of the night. To shoot down German guards and detonate the crucial port infrastructure, the commandos would stream off the ship and onto the docks. To further cause chaos and perplex the defenders, this would be timed to coincide with an RAF raid. The commandos would be scooped up by motor launches and taken back to safety before the Germans realized what had happened. The time delay fuse would set off the explosives for maximum effect and casualties later, when the Germans were examining the rammed ship and checking the lock damage. According to author Ford, the plan was hazardous in the extreme and full of imponderables. The Admiralty first viewed the idea with suspicion and hostility, but Mountbatten and his troops were unfazed and revised the plan, which they renamed Operation Chariot. Chariot was authorized on March 3rd. HMS Campbelltown, an old British destroyer that was previously the USS Buchanan and was transferred to the British as part of the Lend-Lease program, was chosen to play the lead role in this drama. Commander Robert E. Dee, the 34-year-old Red Ryder, was assigned to lead the Royal Navy's participation in the mission. Ryder had already served in submarines, explored the Arctic, and served as a frigate captain during his lengthy Navy career. In addition to fighting off the anticipated German offensive, his duties would include transporting the Campbelltown and accompanying flotilla of motor launches, which resembled American PT boats in size and appearance, the 450 miles to St. Nazaire, and evacuating any remaining commandos back to Britain. Getting ready for the Campbelltown set off for Devonport on March 10, 1942, in an attempt to pose as an enemy cruiser. To make her resemble a German Mu-class destroyer, 2 of her 4 funnels were chopped out, while the other 2 were shortened and angled. In case the Germans smelled a rat and opened fire on the ship, additional armor plating and armaments were fitted. An experienced British commander, Lieutenant Commander Stephen H., would be in charge of the fictitious German vessel, Sam Beatty. A steel tank placed in the ship's forward compartments was loaded with 24 Mark 7 depth charges, each containing 400 pounds of explosives, and sealed behind a concrete wall to provide enough explosive strength to destroy the target. Naval Lieutenant Nigel Tibbets would prime the pencil fuses, which were placed into the charges and had an 8-hour delay, right before the ship rammed the lock. When the fuses were activated, the detonators would blow up the depth charges because the acid in the fuses would dissolve the copper restraining wire. A group of British commandos would train hard for the mission in the interim. The Special Service Brigade, which consisted of 12 volunteer 500-man commando squads, existed in early 1942. Over 200 of the most resilient guys were selected for Operation Chariot out of this group of roughly 6,000 men. Number 2. Commandos Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman, was chosen to lead the ground forces. Before the war, Newman had been in the Territorial Army's Essex Regiment and worked as a building contractor. Despite being 38 years old and far older than the majority of his subordinates, he was well-liked and respected due to his leadership skills and the way he interacted with his guys. Training in demolition techniques designed especially for the St. Nazaire mission was crucial. Bill Pritchard, a captain in the Royal Engineers and an authority on dockyard demolition, was brought on as the instructor. Classes were conducted on equipment comparable to what the commandos would likely find at the ports in Southampton and Cardiff, Wales. The team's training was very realistic, even though they didn't utilize live weapons or genuine demolitions. They were expected to properly position their dummy charges in the dark, frequently with only a few of their mates present, the others being regarded as casualties, after studying as much as they could about the technical operation of locks, pumps, cranes, electrical equipment, and power plants. The other half of the force was undergoing rigorous training in nocturnal street combat skills, while the other half was being trained to become explosives experts. They would serve as the demo men's security teams and help the force fight its way out of the port. Apart from developing their combat abilities and mastering demolitions, the commandos devoted countless hours to reviewing a comprehensive port model and continuously practicing their tasks. Since the raid depended on precise timing, no detail was left to chance. If one component failed or was delayed, the mission as a whole would be in danger. The attack strategy. Reaching the port. The plan was for the entire situation to unfold as follows. 2 Royal Navy destroyers, Tyndale and Atherstone, would accompany the Campbelltown, disguised as a German ship, and a flotilla of 18 motor launches, motor gunboats, and motor torpedo boats carrying commandos to St. Nazaire. The Royal Air Force, operating from British bases, would bomb the port around midnight on D-Day in late March, distracting the defenders' focus and forcing them to seek cover. The Campbelltown would swiftly travel the 6 miles toward the port and approach the mouth of the Loire at the same time. An underwater British submarine, called Sturgeon, would set up shop in the Loire as a navigational beacon to ensure that they could locate it in the dark. The 2 destroyers would disembark as the flotilla arrived at the river's entrance, and the force would take into battle formation. Gunboat, MGB 314, with its radar and echo sounder in the lead, would lead the force across the shallows and mud flats. The motor torpedo boats ML-160 and ML-270 would flank MGB 316, prepared to launch their torpedoes at any ship that poses a threat to the force. Campbelltown would follow, followed by 2 rows of motor launches to the rear and on either side, while the starboard column would proceed to the neighboring Old Entrance. The port column would land their commandos at the Old Mole, a lighthouse-crowned stone pier with a set of stone steps leading down to the water. The back of the column would be covered by 3 further motor launches, MTB-74, ML-446, and ML-298. Additionally, MTB-74 would remain in the rear and, upon request, torpedo the tiny lock at the Old Entrance that opened into the undersea basin. 6 boats ML-192, ML-306, ML-307, ML-443, ML-447, and ML-457 would land teams of commandos to attack 2 pillboxes near the Old Mole. In order to engage shore objectives and lessen the enemy's ability to focus his fire on the commandos, the majority of the remaining motor launches would subsequently patrol up the Loire. The main act of the operation would occur as the commandos were coming ashore to cause chaos and mayhem. The Campbelltown would race toward the Normandy Dock's southern lock gate at full speed and smash into the steel building. Hours later, the time fuse would activate the 9,600-pound stash of explosives buried away. The attack strategy: 3 commando units. 3 groups of Colonel Newman's commandos were assigned to 3 distinct tasks. On the north side of the Old Mole jetty and lighthouse, the first group of 6 teams would disembark from their motor launches. They would then proceed south along the east jetty and onto the docks, where they would destroy the gun positions, lock gates, swing bridges, lifting bridges, and power station that led into the submarine basin. After landing at the Old Entrance, the second group of 5 squads would spread out north and south, demolishing swing bridges, lifting bridges, flak towers, and gun positions along the way. Under Newman's second-in-command, Major Bill Copland, the third group, consisting of 2 protection squads from the Campbelltown and 7 commando assault teams, would disperse throughout the northeast section of the dockyard and demolish the pumping house, the northern and southern winding sheds, and the northern and southern caissons. After being transported to shore by MGB 314, Colonel Newman would establish his temporary headquarters at the Old Entrance das Old Mole, where one of the 7 Campbelltown teams, led by Captain Donald W. Roy, would travel west and secure the meeting spot. Roy's men were supposed to take control of a bridge near the Old Entrance, leave it open for the remaining raiders to use as they returned to the evacuation point, and then blow it up to prevent the Germans from pursuing. Lieutenant Stuart Chant and his team would enter the pumping house and blow up the impeller pumps 40 feet below the ground, while another Campbelltown team, under the command of Lieutenant Christopher Smalley, would destroy the southern winding shed, which was in charge of the mechanism that opened and closed the southern lock gates. This would prevent the dry dock's water from being drained. Under the leadership of Lieutenants Corin Purdon, Robert J.G. Burtonshaw, and Gerard Brett, 3 additional squads from Campbelltown had the most distance to cover. They would leave the ship and go down the dock to the caisson and winding shed on the north side, where they would demolish them and make the northern lock gates useless. Lieutenant John Roderick led another crew that was tasked with destroying 3 gun positions between the river and the Normandy dock, before setting the subterranean fuel storage tanks on fire. All crews were to reconvene at the Old Entrance Old Mole for evacuation when all activities were completed. 3 of the motor launches, ML-160, ML-270, and MGB-314, would provide the Campbelltown commandos with suppressing fire from their deck guns against objectives on the coast. After that, the motor launches would retreat and wait in the river until the demolition work was finished, at which point they would approach the shore to confront the commandos and the Campbelltown team. Operation Chariot was not only extremely risky and audacious, but also suicidal, because all of these activities were planned to take place directly in the middle of the heavily armed German force. All of this meticulous preparation and training was predicated on a number of extremely optimistic presumptions: that enemy resistance would be minimal or non-existent, that the targets would be the same or comparable to the facilities the commandos had been rehearsing on, and that, Once the firing began, everything would proceed according to plan. The start of Operation. After training was over, the 3 destroyers and 18 motor launches that made up the Operation Chariot force sailed out of Falmouth Harbor, which is close to the southwest coast of England, at 2 p.m. on March 26, 1942, for the more than 400-mile open ocean journey. To give the impression that the group may be traveling to Gibraltar, or possibly La Rochelle, which is located more south of Saint Nazaire, the ships and boats set out on a diversionary path. At 7 a.m. on March 27th, a U-boat, the U-593, did discover the group and radioed its location to headquarters, but it did not attempt to intercept it. But after firing at the sub, which caused it to submerge, the flotilla placed depth charges on it. Not long afterward, a fleet of French fishing boats came into view. Because it was known that the Germans occasionally stationed observers on French fishing vessels to spy on Allied ships, Commander Ryder dispatched Atherstone and Tyndale to look into the matter. The personnel of 2 of the trawlers were transferred on board the destroyers, which sank the unarmed boats after failing to locate any German observers. Ryder and Newman knew they were right on the money when the flotilla's lead boat detected the submarine Sturgeon's light at 10 p.m. that evening. As they waited for the opening performance to start, all of the ships turned off their engines and started to bob off the coast of France. The Germans at Saint Nazaire heard the quiet rumbling of a large formation of bombers getting louder and louder about midnight. The alert for the air raid went off. The night was soon filled with flashes of explosions and the whistling sound of bombs dropping. The Campbelltown was below decks, its German Navy banner fluttering at the aft end, when Lieutenant Tibbets pressed the time delay fuse attached to the 9,600 pounds of explosives, and the flotilla started to advance slowly into the Loire. There was growing tension. The radar post at Le Croisic did not react when the ship and its accompanying motor launches passed slowly. The ruse is found by the Germans. On May 28th, it was now 30 minutes after midnight, and the raiders were having good fortune. The British Cunard ocean liner, RMS Lancastria, which was sunk by the Luftwaffe on June 17, 1940, was partially underwater when the flotilla passed it in silence. 2 weeks after the evacuation of Dunkirk, more than 1,730 British citizens and French soldiers perished on the Lancastria, making it the country's biggest maritime tragedy ever. The raiding group continued, moving more and farther into the mouth of the river until they were only 2 miles from their target. In the meantime, the searchlights had been turned off and the German anti-aircraft guns had ceased firing at the aircraft after 22nd Naval Flak Brigade Commander Karl Konrad Mecke grew suspicious of the RAF's peculiar bombing pattern. The planes were circling the harbor, dumping bomb after bomb, rather than just dropping their bombs and going home. He instructed the gun crews to be alert for an airborne raid, speculating that the bombing might be the beginning of a parachute assault. After an hour, a searchlight briefly illuminated the water near the flotilla before being extinguished in the same instant. The seaborne raiders were not shot at. Mecke, however, was awake. He informed all troops in the Saint Nazaire area to be alert for a landing party at 1:20 a.m. after learning of an enigmatic group of incoming vessels that other commands had written off as unlikely. Across the lake, a dozen or more searchlights that were lining the river's banks were now turned on. A signal light on shore flickered out a challenge after a few bullets were fired across the bow of the Campbelltown. The ship's signalman, anticipating this, blinked back in German, "Wait," and then displayed the call sign of an actual German destroyer. A fictitious telegram stating that the ship was injured and asking for permission to travel without delay was then sent. The Germans, clearly falling for the ruse, stopped shooting and let the ship to pass. At this stage, the Campbelltown was flying the German ensign, and we were firmly ordered that we must not open fire at all until the ensign was removed, and we could all fly our white British Royal Navy ensigns again, remembered Frank Arkell, a Royal Navy lieutenant flying in Sub-Lieutenant Mark Rodier's ML-177. After only a few minutes, however, the Germans realized they had been tricked and launched a furious barrage on the ships. The signalman from Campbelltown flashed out, "You are firing on friendly ships," and the guns fell silent once more, albeit momentarily. With tracers flying across the night sky and tall spouts of water launching into the air from the impact of the shells and bullets, the coastal defense artillery, machine guns, and rifles once again began to fire. At this point, the British ensigns emerged, the commandos and naval troops started firing back, and the Campbelltown captain gave the order to go full speed forward. The lock gate to the dry dock was a few hundred yards away, dead ahead of her. "I'm 4 minutes late." When MTB 314, carrying Ryder and Newman, flashed past and opened fire with her Oerlikon deck guns at close range, a German guard ship at the outer harbor started pumping munitions at the passing flotilla. With the exception of the moans of her injured and dying crew, the German ship became silent. The run-in was desperately exciting, the suspense over the haggling about who or what we were, the opening fire from the banks, the silence, and then the final opening up of all the guns, recalled Commando Lieutenant John Roderick, who was on board Campbelltown. One was full of respect for the gun crews of Campbelltown, who were severely wounded. Our Bren guns were equipped for this phase with big ammunition pans, so even though we were lying behind them, we weren't completely dormant. We fired at as many potential targets as we could see. There were tracer bullets going in every direction, a very colorful sight because the British tracers were all orange in color, and the Germans were all a blue-green. Lieutenant Arkell aboard ML-177 continued. Very lovely. When the shells began flying throughout the area, they weren't quite as lovely. Nevertheless, this continued for a while, and the destroyer continued to move forward at full speed, aiming for the dock gates. However, the port line of motor launches began turning in toward their landing spot, which was primarily Old Mole on the dock side, and they began to encounter some severe fire. Regrettably, fire broke out on board several of them. When the destroyer struck the dock gates, which it did with remarkable accuracy, we were in the starboard line. We then passed them to starboard, made a large circle, and passed beneath their stern. It was our responsibility to enter the dock's old entrance, where we accompanied and dropped off our commandos. Nearly every German gun in the vicinity of the harbor turned its attention on the Campbelltown, and the combined firepower struck the ship's hull, deck, and superstructure. Despite the danger, she did not slow down or falter as her skipper, Lieutenant Commander Sam Beatty, rushed on at 20 knots while surrounded by dead and injured crewmen. Before it abruptly turned to the right, Beatty had a free run for the lock gates while MTB 314 continued to fire back at the port's defenders ahead of him. According to author Ford, Campbelltown struck the anti-torpedo net that guarded the lock with sudden force, but the surge of more than 1,000 tons of warship ripped through the steel mesh, and the destroyer sprang forward unabated. A few seconds afterward, the ship slammed into the middle of the enormous steel caisson and trembled to a stop with a low, grinding moan. At 0134 hours, Campbelltown had arrived at her destination only 4 minutes after schedule. The commandos get off the ship. The entire Campbelltown was locked in an upward tilt of around 15 degrees when the destroyer crashed into the steel lock gate with such power that 35 feet of the bow were folded. With their Sten weapons blazing at anything that moved, the ship's commandos started running through the smoke of the burning craft and jumping onto the dock. Lieutenant Roderick remembered, "I hurried forward to reconnoiter the way off the ship after the crash of the bows, which came with surprisingly little jolting. It was a bit of a shambles with many wounded chaps lying about the deck. There were no overt indications of life nearby, and the gun at the ship's bow appeared cockeyed. As we hurried off the Campbelltown, Major Bill Copland gave us his customary command to increase morale. Before we were able to dismount, our bamboo ladders had been shot at. Corporal John Donaldson was in charge of one of them when he was killed, but I was able to locate a section of cable, which we used to scramble onto the dock gate while trying to hide our activities. It was challenging to determine the source of the intense shooting that was and had been occurring. I don't recall hearing gunshots from the initial gun emplacement. As Corporal Howarth and I advanced, some kind of explosion went over my head and injured his leg. After we completed the crew, we took turns covering fire with Lieutenant John Stutchbury and his division. The area over and close to the oil storage tanks needed to be cleared. We hurled grenades with the most amazing bangs into many Nissan huts, and we also killed more enemy personnel in another concrete building. We undoubtedly killed 2 more. We were now moving around the seaward side of the oil tanks, and I think there was a light cannon of some kind at the top, but I didn't go up to look. Covering fire was being directed at John Stutchbury as he advanced to confront a third hostile group. Keeping our eyes alert to everything around us was a full-time task because we had a vast region to cover and fewer personnel. When the gunboats touched down, 6 motor launches ML-156, ML-177, ML-192, ML-262, ML-267, and ML-268 had separated from the formation and were moving at full speed toward the old entrance to land their commandos, while the Campbelltown had been roaring, throttles wide open, for the southern lock gate. The landing parties would soon be overcome by confusion, mayhem, and disaster. A big shell hit the first boat, ML-192, which was piloted by Lieutenant CMDR William L. Stevens, as it was maneuvering toward the old entrance jetty. With multiple people on board, the vessel drifted out of control and finally came to a stop on the east jetty after the explosion destroyed the engine room. The 13 additional commandos on ML-192 were led by Captain Michael Byrne, who successfully disembarked his men and guided them to 2 nearby flak towers, which were discovered to be unattended. According to Stevens's boat's crewman George Davidson, ML-192 was the first ship to be hit. We came to a complete stop just as we were about to pass the old mole. The boat continued to move even while the machinery stopped. Rather than passing the old mole, we collided with the burning engine room. The lighthouse stood at the end of the mole, followed by a searchlight-equipped tower and another flak tower nearer the coast. We came to a halt near the flak tower. I believed there was a chance of landing at the mole since the boat listed to starboard, putting the mast over the top of it. Though it would be challenging, I believed I could scale the mast and descend onto the mole. I ascended it until I saw 2 heads peeking out of the flak tower, at which point I decided it was time to attack. They never fired at me, so I assumed they were just as scared as I was. They didn't anticipate people who would climb masts. The ship was completely on fire when I descended once more, and the skipper gave us the order to leave. After helping him launch a float for the advantage of the non-swimmers, I swam over the bow, swimming parallel to the mole, and then I arose on the beach. ML-262, the third craft under the command of Lieutenant Edward Ted A., was in the middle of this drama. Bert arrived with Lieutenant Mark Woodcock's demolition team, whose task it was to demolish the 2 nearby locks and the bridge across the old entrance. However, the intense searchlights confused Bert, causing him to miss his target by a few hundred yards. Both ships swung wide and were ready to come around again after Lieutenant Eric H. Baird, commanding ML-267, experienced a similar issue behind him. Although Bert and Baird missed their landing places, the 4th craft, ML-268, piloted by Lieutenant Bill Tilley, did not make the same mistake twice. Tilley's boat was ripped apart by enemy shelling as it approached the old entrance's steps, and it exploded in a matter of minutes after catching fire. Out of the 18 commandos on board, only Tilley and half of his crew managed to make it to land. Lieutenant Leslie Fenton's ML-156 was the 5th boat, but it did no better than the boats that came before it. Fenton and Captain Richard H. Hooper, who commanded the 13 commandos on board, were both injured. While under precise German fire, the boat missed its target and circled around once more. Fenton was forced to remove ML-156 from the landing zone and return down the Loire because the engines and steering were damaged and the number of wounded was growing. Later, the damaged boat will be scuttled. Sub-Lieutenant Rodier's ML-177, the 6th and last boat to attempt a landing, managed to escape the flying lead storm and land its group of 13 commandos under the leadership of Troop Sergeant Major George E. Haynes on the old entrance's southern side. The sergeant was not aware that Hooper and ML-156 had not landed, but Haynes had been ordered to join Captain Hooper's company and destroy the German gun positions between the old entrance and the old mole. Nevertheless, Haynes led his men into the shadowed maze of buildings, sheds, and streets, fighting ferociously with astonished German soldiers who were trying to stop the assault. Deploying the explosives. Although the bullets and shells were still flying heavy and fast, Lieutenant Colonel Newman and his headquarters staff were able to land at the old entrance steps thanks to Robert Ryder's command boat, MGB 314, which braved the onslaught. On board 314, William Savage, a skilled seaman, was accurately firing a deck gun. He proceeded to shoot away until he was killed at his gun, despite being exposed and lacking a gun shield. He would get a posthumous Victoria Cross for his deeds. At this point, Commander Ryder came alongside us in his MGB and gave us the instruction to let go our lines and to go alongside the Campbelltown and pick up as many crew as we could and take them home to England, remembered Royal Navy Lieutenant Frank Arkle, who was on board ML-177. Meanwhile, the commandos that had jumped from Campbelltown were still in the middle of the fighting on the docks. Before beginning his assignment, Lieutenant Brett was shot in both legs. He and his troops were hitting the dry dock's southern caisson in an attempt to disable it. Lieutenant Burtonshaw's troops survived a barrage of concentrated enemy fire to get to the northern lock gate and caisson, which was 300 yards away. However, they found that the design of the caisson was different from the one they had practiced on back in England. Even though German machine guns and sharpshooters were raking the commandos, Burtonshaw's troops were unable to approach the caisson's interior and strung the explosives as best they could. Burtonshaw himself suffered fatal injuries. In lieu of his deceased commander, a sergeant named Carr set off the explosives, severely damaging the northern caisson. Even though he had been struck before leaving Campbelltown, Lieutenant Chant continued and, along with his party, buried their charges 40 feet below the pumping house, destroying it. Under the general supervision of Lieutenant Smalley and Purdon, Lieutenant Bill Etches made sure that the two winding huts were demolished by those crews. However, the Germans' fire became more precise and intense. Burtonshaw's and 6 other commandos' bodies had to be left where they fell, because if the troop did not instantly retreat and flee to the old entrance, which was more than 300 yards away, they would all be destroyed. Despite the deluge of lead pouring into the restricted space, the 2 launches that had previously missed their target, Bert's ML-262 and Baird's ML-267, returned to the old entrance and attempted to land once more. Before being compelled to cast off, Bert valiantly landed Woodcock's demolition crew at the northern quay with Lieutenant R.F. Morgan's security unit. When it came to running back to the quay, Morgan's squad had only gone inland a short distance. They demanded to be allowed to reboard the craft after one of the men saw a German tracer round burn through the air and mistook it for a flare, telling the landing party to retreat. Still shattered by enemy fire, Bert's craft dallied long enough for Morgan's troops to re-enter. The withdraw. Lieutenant Smalley's team arrived at around the same time, having completed its task at the northern caisson. Instead of going as planned to the Old Mole, Smalley and his men spotted Bert's vessel and rushed to it. Bert put it back in the dock and allowed them to clamber on board. ML-262 raced off toward open water, trailing a cloud of smoke and exhaust, but Smalley was killed when it was once more targeted by every German gun in its range. Despite being extensively shot up, ML-262 barely made it out alive. Baird's ML-267 approached the old entrance during the melee in order to land its load of commandos, Newman's reserves. However, as soon as a few of the commandos disembarked near the southern stairs, Baird was forced to retreat due to the intense fire. Those on board abandoned the boat as it caught fire and started to drift aimlessly. Many were raked by machine gun fire while in the sea. Lieutenant Bart was murdered along with 8 commandos and 10 members of his crew. At last, MTB-74, one of Lieutenant Mickey Wynn's 2 motor torpedo boats, joined the battle. Wynn went over to help Ryder, MTB-314, and Rodier, ML-177, evacuate the sailors from the wrecked Campbelltown after torpedoing the lock gates that blocked the old entrance from the submarine basin. The time delay fuses on the torpedoes would go off 2 days later. Struggling to ignite the underground fuel storage tanks due to enemy fire, Lieutenant Roderick and his group battled their way to the assembly site, which was Newman's makeshift headquarters next to the old entrance. We had to shift between fire bursts, so it was clear that others were observing our movements, Roderick said. I got wounded through my left leg as I was fleeing for cover with the Bren weapons. I only knew that I had been pushed head over heels and that the Bren had left my hands, so it was a total surprise. The remainder of my party had already assembled at Colonel Newman's assembly place, so I made my way there after swiftly moving behind a stand. The following squadron of 6 motor launches chose to land at the neighboring Old Mole, but they were unsuccessful in their attempt to land more commandos at the old entrance. Captain David Birney's 14 troops were dropped off by Lieutenant T.D.L. Platt's ML-447, but the bunkers there fired a withering torrent of bullets at them. Its Oerlikon weapons and gun operators were knocked out when the launch was struck. A large caliber shell then tore the ship apart as Platt limped near the old entrance and attempted to reach the stone steps. Only a few men managed to reach the steps. The others were thrown into the murky waters of the port, where they drowned, or were murdered directly by the blast. Fortunately, ML-457's commanding Lieutenant Thomas Collier managed to get his 3 teams of commandos directly up to the steps. Lieutenant Walton commanded a 4-person demolitions team. In the first, Captain Bill Pritchard, the dockyard demolition instructor, led a control party in the second, and Lieutenant William H. led a 4-person protection party in the third. Watson, Tiger. Lieutenant Norman Wallace's ML-307, which was transporting Captain E.W. Bradley and 6 commandos, trailed closely behind Collier's boat. However, Wallace ran aground after hitting an undersea obstruction. Enemy fire was now focused on the stranded ship. Bradley ordered Wallace to engage the German guns and searchlights around the quays and jetties that threatened to end the operation after Wallace had freed ML-307 from its perch. Following in the wake of ML-307 were ML-306 under Lieutenant Ian Henderson, ML-443 under Lieutenant K. Horlock, and ML-446 under Lieutenant Dick Falconar. However, the boats were unable to approach the old entrance because the waters were congested with burning and damaged motor launches, injured troops, and flying lead. In order to find a different, less lethal location to land their commando troops, the 3 skippers decided to pull out. It was a hopeless endeavor. Captured commandos. To ram the dock gates as it had, the Campbelltown had to go through some anti-submarine nets in order to get there, and a lot of these nets were still hanging off its sides as we were trying to come alongside. We had to be very careful of this in order to not get them tangled around our own propellers, Frank Arkle recalled, while aboard Raudier's ML-177, closing in to rescue Campbelltown's survivors. Nevertheless, we were able to bring our bow alongside and remove several of the crew members, including the captain, Sam Beatty, and several of his officers, including the medical officer, numerous wounded, and a few commandos. Rodier backed away from the stern of the warship and went to sea, but it was a short way to safety. We sped down towards the open sea as fast as we could, which was a full 18 knots, Arkle added. We believed it was time to get our smokescreen operational since we were increasingly being hit by shore-based artillery. Unfortunately, the first shell struck us while we were working on this, entering the engine room. Apparently, it caused one of our engines to shift directly on top of the other, rendering them both inoperable. Mark Rodier and Commander Beatty were on the bridge, while I was on the stern. We were both standing aft when Beatty descended near the funnel, and we were struck by another shell. Even now, I can still see the funnel breaking apart, seemingly very slowly, and the shell exploding in the center. I was fortunate that poor Mark was directly between me and the shell, so he was spared the force of the explosion that would have struck me had he not been there. I was struck primarily in the face, but not much else, all the way down my left side. I thought there was only one thing to do when I felt my right eye on my cheek and thought it had been blown out of my head and was hanging down my cheek, so I pulled it out and threw it overboard. After that, despite the fact that we were on fire amidships, I walked down to the wardroom and obtained something to wrap around my head as a kind of bandage over my injured eye. I was also limping because my left foot was messed up a lot. The ML-177 was blazing. Lieutenant Tibbets, who had set the time fuse in Campbelltown, was dead, as was Rodier. The decision to abandon ship was made when Beatty and Arkle both agreed that there was nothing else that could be done to rescue the boat. Arkle clung to a piece of floating rubble with a couple other commandos. He claimed that once we made the decision to swim toward the closest shoreline, I quickly realized that we were wasting our energy completely because we were just going round in circles. I therefore made the decision to try and retrieve a tiny pewter whiskey flask from my pocket. After an hour or two in the water, I believe that even though we continued to move to try to maintain circulation, we were starting to feel the effects of the cold. Ultimately, I found that my hands were so cold that I was unable to undo the button on my hip pocket to remove the flask, so I had to give up. Around that time, the survivors were discovered floating by a huge armed German trawler, which lowered scramble nets over the side. Arkell clambered up and boarded the ship somehow. By this point, I believe I had lost a significant amount of blood due to a big hole in my left hip. They instructed us to lie on the deck. We were being watched by German sentries brandishing weapons when one of them finally arrived with cups of fake coffee. Commander Beatty was also captured. Near the old mole, survival scenes were still being acted out. George Davidson remembered that the Germans took the crew hostage after they abandoned the listing, ML-192, and marched us off in a southerly direction. There was a lot of firing on the way. I slid in between some rolls of wire netting, which looked like chicken wire, while we were ducking and dodging. They simply marched off without me once I laid doggo. I was still there by daytime, even though it was before 2 in the morning. I knew I had to go, but I was captured right away after running into some Germans. Fortunately, Davidson was only taken prisoner and not shot. I was quite concerned because there were some trigger-happy ones among them, but fortunately the officer who was in charge of them seemed to be a steady type and ordered me to walk over towards the mole and made me stand with my back to the parapet, and I thought it was curtains. All we can do is walk home. In the meantime, commandos began withdrawing toward the old entrance, and by 2:30 a.m., they had gathered inside Newman's headquarters, prepared for a boat escape. However, there were no more boats available. Already there was widespread destruction in the tiny harbor. The motor launches that were lost, together with their workers, were burning ferociously and bobbed around helplessly. The searchlights hauntingly showed the smoking debris, dotted with massive flaming puddles of fuel and the floating remains of dead commandos and sailors. Colonel Newman saw that the commandos were in a precarious situation as more and more groups crowded into the headquarters. The majority of individuals who showed up were injured, some severely, and could not be moved. It also became evident that Newman's escape path was being swept by machine guns and large-caliber weaponry, making it impossible to return to the old entrance or the old mole due to the unrelenting amount of fire outside. Therefore, the only choice was to escape out of the building, cross the bridge into St. Nazaire, scatter, and run away in the hopes of vanishing into the countryside. The commandos might be able to return to Britain with the aid of some French underground organizations. With characteristic British swagger, Newman assembled his soldiers and announced, "Well, chaps, we've missed the boat. We'll simply have to walk home." On March 28th, at 3 in the morning, the commandos, each helping a wounded friend, ran out the door and, in a final act of unselfish bravery, battled their way across the bridge into town and through the warehouses that fronted the submarine dock. Lieutenant Roderick recalled the breakout attempt clearly. With Captain Roy, Lieutenants Len, Hoppy Hopwood, and Bill Watson, Sergeant Alf Pearson, and other soldiers serving as forward section, he and his troops rushed toward the bridge. As all house and street combat must be, Roderick remarked, this stage was especially exciting and full of surprises. I injected Tiger Watson with morphine after he was shot in the humerus during one of these skirmishes. As attempts to cross the bridge at this time were suicidal, Hoppy Hopwood, Alf Pearson, and 1 or 2 other people whose names escape me were exploring among some warehouses after leaving Tiger as comfortable as possible. I was hit in the head by a grenade about this. We made a nest of full cement sacks high off the ground after it was decided that we needed to find a good hiding place. At this point, we were a really ropey bunch, and Alf Pearson had suffered a serious injury to his left shoulder, which prevented him from actively participating. We did, however, have a pretty good hiding place, and during the course of the following few hours, we were frequently passed by search parties of Germans who were by this point in the region as reinforcement. German roadblocks had blocked the streets by early AM, and the commandos had run out of ammunition and choices. A German searching high up in a warehouse on the other side of the road saw a bandaged head or limb through some bomb damage in our warehouse wall and gave the alarm only in the daylight at around 10:30 a.m., Roderick explained. The place came to life in an instant, and we gave ourselves up. Life was still sweet, and opposition would have been pointless. Disappointed, our captors placed us up against a wall and searched us. We believed we had had enough. Nearly every commando was murdered or taken prisoner. Only 5 guys would eventually make it back to England. 5 boats come back. About 45 miles from Saint Nazaire, the German destroyer Jaguar came in to intercept the flotilla after the motor launches had retired out to sea. After firing a burst at ML-306 and telling it to stop, the Jaguar's commander was taken aback by the British response, which came in the form of a barrage of return fire from a Lewis gun that was being fired by Sergeant Thomas F. Durant, a 23-year-old commando. Durant held the German ship at bay as a one-man assault team until the sergeant was killed in a running gunfight. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his valor. Durant is among the select few who were recommended by the captain of the destroyer, an enemy officer, to get their VC. Only 5 of the 18 initial raiding boats, ML-306, ML-307, ML-443, ML-446, and MGB-314, were able to meet up with the 2 British destroyers. The final hurrah of the raid. The final and most spectacular act of the operation occurred as the remaining commandos who had not been evacuated either fought desperate battles, escaped the enemy, or were captured by the Germans. The wrecked Campbelltown, still beached at its upward angle above the lock gates, had attracted a sizable gathering of onlookers by mid-morning on March 28th. While some were below decks examining the thick concrete wall and probably assuming that the concrete was there, only to give the ship's prow, which had been used as a battering ram, more strength, others had even stepped aboard her to marvel at the British ingenuity. Nobody noticed that the final piece of copper wire was going to be eaten away by the acid in the pencil detonator on the opposite side of the concrete slab. The focus of everyone's attention was generating puzzled looks when it disappeared with a powerful bang and a brilliant flash. Human bodies and steel fragments were flung all about. 2 German tankers inside capsized and sank as a result of the lock gates splitting apart and letting a tidal wave of seawater into the dry chamber. Lieutenant Roderick remembered that when the Campbelltown erupted, he and a handful of his friends were being kept captive in the river on a small boat. Everyone else ran to see what it was all about, but we were left with our guards. Soon after, we were loaded onto a vehicle and driven into the town, where we were placed in a private residence before being transferred to the Le Bowl Hospital. The destruction was enormous. Weak structures collapsed and windows were blown out in nearby blocks. People were knocked flat and cars were overturned. A few structures caught fire. Numerous German defenders were killed or injured. Until 1947, the Normandy dock was in ruins and could not be used. It had no possibility of ever being used by the Tirpitz or any other German vessel. The greatest of all raids. Despite being extremely costly, Operation Chariot had been a successful raid. Even at the expense of their lives, all those who participated in the Saint Nazaire raid, which the British considered to be the greatest raid of all, surrounded themselves with glory. On that terrible night, Beatty, Newman, Ryder, Savage, and Durant earned 5 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest medal for gallantry. The action at Saint Nazaire also resulted in the awarding of 24 Distinguished Service Medals, 15 military medals, 4 Conspicuous Gallantry Medals, 5 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 17 Distinguished Service Crosses, 11 Military Crosses, and 4 Distinguished Service Orders. But there were a lot of casualties. The majority of the tiny ships were destroyed or sunk. Out of the 611 participating soldiers and sailors, 200 were captured and 168 were slain. A vengeful Hitler issued his notorious Commando Order in response to this achievement, and the October 3-4, 1942 commando operation on the island of Sark in the Channel Islands. It said that commandos would not be entitled to the Geneva Convention's protections, and that, from now on, all men operating against German troops in so-called commando raids in Europe or in Africa are to be annihilated to the last man. Over 60 years later, the British still view the Saint Nazaire raid as one of the war's most valiant and successful operations. Memorials and plaques honoring the raiders have been placed at the port. The Escoublac-Le Bowl War Cemetery, located 11 miles west of Saint Nazaire, is the final resting place for 1/3 of the British troops and sailors who perished in the raid. It was best summed up by Lord Lovat, who would lead British commandos ashore at Sword Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Saint without a doubt, the greatest stunning seaborne raid of World War II was Nazaire.